Welcome to the Mindful Fire podcast. If you're enjoying the show, please leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcast. My dad will be so grateful. See you next time on the Mindful Fire podcast.
On today's episode of the podcast, I'm excited to bring you a really special guest, Sarah McCrumb. Sarah was introduced to me by a former guest, Morgan Bricca. Morgan joined us on episodes 6, 7, and 14 of the podcast. Out of the blue, Morgan emailed me about a book called Love Money, Money Loves You. She said it was like nothing she's ever seen before and that it totally changed how she thinks about financial independence and the FIRE movement overall. Obviously, this caught my attention, so I grabbed the audiobook and started listening to it right away. And I will say this book is like nothing I've ever heard before. It takes a totally different approach to money, and I'm so excited to bring you this episode with Sarah. Let's jump into today's episode. Welcome to the Mindful Fire podcast, a show about crafting a life you love and making work optional, using the tools of mindfulness, envisioning, and financial independence. I'm your host, Adam Cuello, and I'm so glad you're here. Each episode of the Mindful Fire podcast explores these 3 tools through teachings, guided meditations, and inspiring interviews with people actually living them to craft a life they love. At its core, Mindful Fire is about creating more awareness and choice in your life. Mindfulness helps you develop self-awareness to know yourself better and what's most important to you by practicing a kind, curious awareness. Envisioning is all about choosing to think big about your life and putting the power of your predicting brain to work to create the life you dream of. And financial independence brings awareness and choice to your financial life, empowering you to make your vision a reality by getting your money sorted out and ultimately making work optional. And here's the best part. You don't have to wait until you reach financial independence to live out your vision. Mindful Fire is about using these tools to craft that life now on the path to financial independence and beyond. If you're ready to start your Mindful Fire journey, go to mindfulfire.org/start and download my free envisioning guide. In just 10 minutes, this guide will help you craft a clear and inspiring vision for your life. Again, you can download it for free at mindfulfire.org/start. Let's jump into today's episode. Sarah, welcome to the Mindful Fire podcast. I'm so glad to have you here.
Thank you very much. I'm really delighted to be here.
So I'd love to have you start by sharing with the audience a little bit about who you are, your journey, and what you're up to in the world.
At my core, I'm a teacher. I teach people about their relationship with money. Actually, what I really teach people is how to liberate their spirit. And I found that teaching people about their relationship with money is a particularly powerful way to do that I probably wouldn't have expected if I hadn't done it. That teaching that I do is rooted in many, many years of studying and training and practicing with Chinese masters. So it was 22 years in total. So my language, if you like, is the language of energy, which is the traditional way that the Chinese used to view everything in life, through this lens of life is energy. Everything's alive and everything that comes out of that. The other thing that I'm extremely engaged with is a new business that launched very recently that's called Love To, which really takes my work on money to a much bigger level. What we've really done is to create a new financial product that's backed by the regeneration and protection of nature and of human health and well-being. It's a problem that hasn't really been solved very well until now, and it enables large-scale investment to be brought to the grassroots people who actually do the best work in the world and make the most contribution in this space. So yes, there's quite a lot going on right now.
So I'd love to go a little bit deeper on the book and your journey with money. Can you share a little bit about your journey with money and how the book Love Money, Money Loves You came into the world?
My journey with money really was initiated by growing up in a very middle-class British family where we were taught not to talk about money. It was money, sex, and politics. Oh, and religion, of course. it was always dangerous territory. You weren't supposed to talk about them with other people. So we didn't really talk about it. And that's pretty much how I grew up. Interestingly, when I look back on it now, when I used to work for BBC Radio, and when they enabled independent producers to make programs for the BBC, before it was always just freelance or in-house. So they created a system where a business could do it. I was one of the first people to sign up, but I didn't even know that was a business that I was doing. I had no concept of business language. And then later I went on and started another business, but still from that mindset, mostly of as much as possible, just like the money's not really my thing. I knew I had to deal with it, but I didn't have that real interest in money that you actually need, I think, to run a business. And during the 2008 crash, I'd been away from the business for a while, but I came back to it, and they'd lost pretty much 90% of everything overnight. It was an absolute disaster. And we struggled for a while, getting more and more behind with our rent and all of that kind of thing. And in the end, we had to close it, which was a very challenging, really unpleasant situation because we had clients and suppliers and all of that. But it was actually then, which was financially, I would say, the lowest point of my life, because I remember that we didn't really have enough money to pay the rent of the apartment that we were living in at that time. It was then that the book thing happened. So I'll explain what happened. I'd been given this little book at a sort of business boot camp weekend, which was called How to Become a Money Magnet. And it had questions at the end of the chapters. And one of them said, what would money like to say to you? And I didn't really think much of it, but I just started writing, and my pen literally started writing for itself. It was completely automatic writing. And I was watching words coming out of the pen, which were the words of money. They were not my words. It was like money was speaking to me. And the very first thing it said to me was, I would like to tell you to love me, which was very surprising. And then it went on to explain, it said things like, I'm energy, I'm very powerful and beautiful, and you can do whatever you want with me, really, is what it was saying. And don't be afraid. You're far too afraid and too rigid. Like, take me. I'm here for you. I'm totally available. And it said that it helps to connect human beings together in their creativity, which of course makes sense if you think about it, but it was very different from how I used to think about money. So after that, I started writing every day because it was a very cool experience. It was, and very beautiful. When I read back what I'd written, it's like, oh my goodness, this is amazing. So I started writing every day in the same way and ended up with, I think at that time, about more than 60 writings, messages from money, essentially. And something occurred to me. It's like, oh, I think this would probably be a book. I don't think this was just meant for me. So I turned it into a book, which is called Love Money, Money Loves You. It's got a few extra chapters now. And a few years after that, I moved to Australia with my husband, and we had no money. And we literally had to figure out, in a completely strange country where we didn't know a single person, how to make money and pay the rent really fast. We had a couple of weeks to get sorted out. And I went to the book and I just followed the instructions in the book. And initially it was like a primer for manifestation. I'd help. I don't know how to pay the rent. Please. It was like, money, please just sort this out for me. And time again, it worked. And so I started to learn this different way of relating with money through practice. Got myself out of lots of sticky situations in the early days, and then started to build my business, and then gradually grew everything, and then started to get into this conversation that turned into Love To, which is on its way to becoming a very big and very significant business also at a financial level. Yeah, so I went from being totally broke to having a completely different way of seeing and understanding and experiencing money.
That is wild. That is a wild story. I appreciate the additional context as well. It's a lot shorter in the book. I imagine you're trying to get into the book. There's quite a bit in there. So I appreciate the additional context. So it sounds like you were doing this exercise and just started writing, and this came to you. You spent a bunch of time writing each day, and you had the manual, so to speak. And then you moved to Australia, needed money, and decided to pick up the manual and give it a try.
Pretty much exactly like that. And honestly, although I'd written it, because I knew it really was not my words, I was writing stuff in there that I didn't know all the way through. It was genuinely surprising. So it was like picking up the manual. And it was like giving it a try. And sometimes it was like, really, no, is this really true? Because it's so beautiful what it says in the book. And it's touching and simple. And sometimes there's an innocence to it that it feels like we've lost as human beings, but it brings us straight back into touch with it. And it's so appealing. And yet it feels almost dangerous to go there in case it's not true. I almost felt sometimes I wanted to protect myself because I wanted life to be like that. I didn't want life to be like it appears to be now, where it's so complicated and heavy and conflicted and manipulated. But actually what I found was that even if I didn't fully believe it, like I couldn't fully trust it, every time I said, I want it to be like this, I got a result. And if I sat in my, I don't know if this is right, I don't know if it's really true, am I supposed to go and do everything differently? It just felt horrible. So I started to learn to follow the advice in the book, which is really to follow your feeling, actually, and to see what felt good and what didn't feel good and follow what felt good. And that became a really strong guidance system for me.
Yeah, that's really interesting. There's a real simplicity. I relate a lot with how you're describing the wanting it to be true, but being like, I don't know. Is it really that easy? Is it really that easy? There's just a simplicity to it. And yeah, the whole thing about following your feeling and following what feels good, again, makes total sense. But I think there's a part about this in the book, but there's so many shoulds in life and so much seriousness and responsibilities that we have. And it feels counterintuitive to just follow the joy, follow the good feelings.
The interesting thing that I found is that when you open up this relationship with money, you actually become more responsible, but it's lighter. So you let go of a lot of that seriousness. You can genuinely find joy even in your relationship with money and in business, which is amazing. It's what everybody's looking for, but feels like it's almost impossible. And like, why would business and joy go together? But actually, I did find that, funnily enough, through this relationship with money. But the biggest thing I find is that people start to accept and take responsibility, like recognizing the power of money. And that if you have money flowing through your life, you're either contributing some really good work through business, somebody's business or your business, or if you're investing, you have the power to do something with your money that makes a difference to the world. And every single investment you make makes a difference to the world. That's for sure. But what difference is it making? And I've been shocked sometimes talking with friends recently who are very principled and very into the environment and farm regeneratively and these kinds of things. And then you realize that when it comes to their investments, it's like all of that goes out of the window. And they don't think about the consequence of what their money is doing in the world. And that creates a kind of cognitive dissonance because it means that you just abandon your values because it's got something to do with money. That doesn't feel good.
Yeah. It gets away from the power of money, the power that it has to affect things, to connect people, to create opportunities in good or bad ways in the world. So if you just ignore that, you're missing the point, I think.
I think so. And look, it's very understandable because there's been a long history of people making ethical investments that failed. And you don't invest money to lose money. It can happen, but it certainly shouldn't be the intention. But the world has changed a long way from then. I remember in the 80s, I inherited some money and I was trying to talk about ethical investment with my stockbroker at the time. It was like the kind of thing which would make his eyebrows wiggle because he really just didn't have that language at all. And it was very worthy on my part. It was that rather serious, stodgy, worthy approach. But I think the world is a very different place now. And we're beginning to see that. I'm seeing people, even in Love To, we raised some seed investment last year. And I saw people invest with their hearts and say that it changed their life. It literally, I saw a couple who said that it changed their relationship in their life because they had to think about purpose in making that investment. It wasn't a huge amount of money. And ever since then, it's helped them to be on purpose. And I've seen someone else who says, every time I'm having a hard time in my business, she runs a property business, I just remember that I've invested in something that's doing good and it lifts me up. So I think there's a growing hunger to bring our values, our deep values, in line with our actions, whether it's the work we do or what we do with our money and how we are with our family, with all of our life, to align it because it just feels so uncomfortable not to do that.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, speaking of purpose, one of the things that attracted me so much to the language of the book and some of what you've already shared here today is the idea of money connecting people. I've come to find that my purpose is creating opportunity through connection. And so this very much aligns with that. And I often think about connecting people together to create opportunities, helping my friends find jobs or introducing them to each other. Like Morgan introduced me to you. She's been on the podcast 3 times. And a lot of opportunity has come from me meeting Morgan randomly at a water cooler, literally a water cooler at a dance party after a Wisdom 2.0 event. So it's just these chance connections can really make a huge difference. And so applying that to money and hearing you talk about money as currency of connection between humans and connection and creativity is totally aligned with how I think about everything, really. So it's pretty cool.
Yeah. And if you allow money to be an energy of love, which is a connecting energy, and you allow it to be less transactional and more relational in that way, then it becomes really understandable how it connects people. Like love in a relationship connects people. If I would see my husband as a transactional contract, I'm here to get something out of him and he's here to get something out of me. You know, I have to give something for what I'm going to get and he has to give something to me. That's not love. And that doesn't feel like, oh, that's the kind of marriage I want to have. That just doesn't. So it's the same with money. Like if you can have this connected space in your relationship with money, it becomes really natural. And I think what's interesting then, and we're beginning to work on now, is how do we value those people who connect people? Because I know many people who are brilliant connectors, and actually they never really get rewarded for that because it's not mostly recognized, or they have to do things that don't feel good to them, like get affiliate fees or some kind of commissions. And you don't connect people from that space. You connect people because you see connections, not because you're trying to get some money out of the situation. And I've had people have really clunky conversations with me, like, if I introduce you to this person and it works out, will you pay me something? And it's like, it feels tacky to me.
Doesn't feel good. It doesn't feel good. Yeah, it really does.
Even if I love money, it still doesn't feel good. It's putting the money in the wrong place. So that's one of the things I'm very interested in, is how do we really value the people who have those connections and nurture them and bring things together and make them work?
I'm curious if you have an example of the kind of love and connecting energy of money. Do you talk about this in the book a little bit about like how when we spend money to another business that's creating value, we share in that? Can you give an example of how money flowing from one person to another is a connecting, loving energy?
I think there are layers to this. At one level, this is really obvious, but I think it's worth stating. If I spend some money on something, I receive something that I want, presumably. So that's an enhancement to my life. I've got something that I want, and it's more valuable than the money that I paid for it. But the interesting thing when I pay some money to somebody is I give them a piece of freedom. That's how I always think of it, because I give them not something that I've got that they might or might not want. I give them the freedom to get whatever they want with that money. So I see money as being, in a way, I give freedom in exchange for something that I've chosen from my freedom. So it's an expression of freedom in that way. What I think is really interesting, and again, it's a concept that's quite well understood, but it really bears telling the story again, because this helped me to understand how much freedom there is in money. If I'm holding $100 bill in my hand here and I give it to you, you give me some service, you sell me something that I want. So I had $100 to begin with, and that's all. It was $100 and it was a piece of paper. It didn't even really have any value. It's just a promise. When I pass that from my hand to your hand, it gains value, because actually I've valued something that you have. If I don't value anything that you have, I'm not going to give you that money. And so it's going to stay a piece of paper. And if I keep it under my bed, it could pretty much lose value or become obsolete. Literally, it doesn't have any intrinsic value for all of whatever anybody says. But if I pay it to you, by my valuing you, I put that value really into that $100 bill. But what's really interesting now is that $100 has given me $100 worth of value, and it's now giving you $100 worth. So it's now got $200 actually. If you put it under your bed, it's going to stay at $200. But if you find something that's valuable to you, you transfer that value into that $100 bill so it's not paper anymore. And it's done $300 worth of work. So as long as the money keeps circulating, a small amount of money just keeps growing and growing and growing and growing. Now, obviously, when we have an entire economy built on debt, there's something eating away at that money all the time. But let's take that out for the moment, because that's not a fundamental principle of money. The fundamental principle of money is that it's expansive and generative. And our economy should be built on that, not on eating pieces of money for personal gain, because there's so much of it, we don't actually need to have that kind of small-minded approach to it.
Yeah, that's a really interesting example of when you give that person the $100, it becomes $200 of value, right? Because you received what they gave you, which you valued at $100, and they received the $100, which they can have the freedom to buy anything they want or invest or buy a house or whatever.
And it might be worth a whole lot more in that case, because they might invest it and it also becomes more. And it's so fascinating when you think about it. And if you make good purchases, you buy something that is worth more than the money and gives you more than the money. So let's say I buy a bit of education, for example, that helps me to become more skillful in my business so I make more money. That $100 could be worth, I don't know, $100,000 actually in terms of real value.
Right.
$1 million or way more than that. If we look at real value rather than a very limited conception of value that's determined by our current markets.
Yeah, that is very interesting. Very interesting. Again, it makes sense, but it's counter to how we think about it now, how we're taught to think about money. It makes obvious sense.
I don't think it's counter to nature. I don't think it's even counter to human nature. It's just counter to our current culture, which is built on what we've learned, exactly how we view things at the moment. I just see that it's a bit of a flawed view.
Yeah. So, Sarah, we were just talking about the expansive nature of money and how it doesn't really have value until we transact with it or till we connect with others in it.
Until we give it value, and we can only give it value by sharing it with somebody else.
Exactly. So as we share it with others, it expands in value. Using that example we just went through, you bought something for $100. Now it's worth $200, and it goes on from there. And so I'm interested, where does that take us? I know that you're a big believer that our creative potential is connected with our relationship with money. So would love to hear you talk about how we can maximize our creative potential by changing the way we relate to money.
Well, I meet a lot of people who are very purpose-centered. They really care about the world or some part of it. They care about people's health and well-being, or they care about nature or something. It means a great deal to them. And they feel that they're not able to achieve their potential. And almost always, they haven't got to grips with money. Sometimes they hate money. They feel guilty about it. They reject it in all kinds of ways. And it's really helpful to use that example, because when somebody feels like that about money and therefore they reject it, of course it reduces their ability to reach their potential, because it means they're going to limit the number of people they work with. They're going to limit the business opportunities they can create. They're going to limit themselves at every step. Because if you're afraid of money, or you don't want too much of it, or you think it's immoral, or it's going to corrupt you, why would you go and make your capacity for doing good in the world better? Because you have to work with more money then. And it doesn't matter whether you're non-profit or for-profit. A non-profit just has to ask for money all over the place. The more good they want to do, the more money they have to ask for. It's actually easier to be for-profit because you can give somebody something in return. A non-profit kind of just has to give somewhat status or prestige, or you'll feel really good about yourself if you do this. So business is in many ways easier. So to me, if you have a sense of purpose and you don't deal with the material aspects of it, then you never really experience that fulfillment, and you never really release the full creativity of who you are. Equally, if you're very locked in the material and you don't have that expanded sense of purpose and of who you are as a human being, the world will always feel like there's something missing. And you'll search everywhere, whether you're searching in the next car and the next house or the next investment return or the next business, whatever it is, you'll keep searching and keep trying things. But as long as your focus is very material, it will always feel as though there's a hole. It's like there's a hole in your soul, literally. And what I found is when we bring these two together, we bring the material and the spiritual, or the purpose and the stuff that makes purpose work, the down on the ground, tires, rubber on the road kind of stuff that makes your purpose work. That will always include money, and it will always include an expansion in your financial capacity. That's also where fulfillment lies.
So this podcast is all about the financial independence, retire early movement, but with a mindful spin on it. Often people in the financial independence, retire early community are so focused on the money, so focused on getting to X dollars so that they can retire and live off of Y dollars per year. And it becomes like they put on the blinders and they just go for it. And frugality is a huge part of that in a lot of cases. And that is pretty good in a lot of ways because they're not spending on things that they don't need. But that focus on just the dollars and cents of things without the larger purpose guiding the vision of like, where am I trying to go? What life am I trying to live? A lot of people get to the finish line and are like, oh, now what? And something you said earlier around trying to find fulfillment in the next car or the next house or the next experience. And I relate a lot to that. And we were talking before we started recording how I had this vision of this house that I wanted to design and build. And this room that I'm in is that vision. And I've fulfilled it. And now that I have this, it's just like, oh, now I want to build a skate park casita in the yard. And I could talk for an hour about that. And I have on other podcasts, so we won't go there. It's always just, if only this, then I'll be happy. And so how do we marry the two, right? How do we find that balance between being open to receiving and having a vision for our life, but not getting so caught up in one or the other that we really lose the balance?
Very interesting. I'm thinking that I'm probably going to be very unpopular with your audience. I don't mind. I met Vicky Robin a few years ago, who's one of the people who was the leader of that movement that you're describing there. And she talked about how in many ways it had got not exactly hijacked, but it had gone off on a thread that I think was probably not really intended. And I have seen that. And a different version of it, it is really different. But in Australia, where I live, I would say the Australian dream is to retire at 55. So you guys are probably wanting to get there a bit earlier than 55. But honestly, it's to retire at 55 and get a place by the beach and have a surfboard. But it's a different version of the same thing. It's like, when I'm done with this, then I'll be able to live. But this that you're trying to get done with more quickly is life. And if you don't learn how to live now, when you get to wherever it is you're trying to get to, you're not going to be any better at living then. And you may actually be worse because you've cut off so many things as you went along in trying to reach these very tight goals that you actually cut off some of your capacity for life. Yeah, it's a challenging one. I think it is possible to be frugal for sure. And look, I don't think there's anything wrong with whatever financial goals you have. But I think what's important is to recognize that your life is not about money. Your life is about you living and you being a contribution to the world. And so we talk about purpose, whether you like the word or not. Human beings generally, when they feel they're doing something that's valuable, genuinely valuable for others, they feel good. They feel fulfillment. They feel like, oh, I'm doing my potential. I'm on track in my life. This is what life is supposed to feel like. When we're chasing the next thing, we usually are very focused on what's missing. And we always think the next thing is what's missing. So when I get it, I'll have it. But as you said, when we get there, it's still missing. Actually, what we're doing is missing that kind of life part because we're chasing the thing. Now, the interesting thing is when you turn it around the other way, if you open yourself up to life and to really living now, and that doesn't mean you have to throw yourself away or you have to get really extravagant. But if you open yourself up to the generosity of life, I think that's a good way to put it. Life is actually much more generous than we tend to think of it. And a lot is possible. You could reach your financial goal, and at the same time, it leads you into a very purposeful, really beautiful, enjoyable life continuing from the moment where you reach financial independence. So financial independence just becomes a milestone that you pass through along the way. And some people will get there earlier and some people will get there later because of the choices they make. And that's all it is, really. So it isn't the goal. It's like if you're going for a walk, it's one of the stones you walk past on that walk. But the purpose of the walk is not to get to the other end. It's to enjoy the walk. It's to enjoy the experience, have a rich experience. So I often talk about having a rich experience. I think that when we look for financial freedom and financial wealth, we're actually looking for richness in our life, and we think it's going to come just from money. A rich life comes from living a rich life, and it's very difficult to do that without money, and it's very difficult to do that if money is the focus.
Yes, all of that. Yes. I assume you saw me nodding. I'm like, yeah, yes. Oh my God. Yes. That is so true, that what you said about we are racing towards the point of financial independence so that we can live, and all the while missing our life that's happening every moment. And that is really what I'm focused on with this podcast is let's live mindfully in this moment, all the moments of our life. And I liked what you said about financial independence just being a stone along the path that you walk past as you're living your best life all along the way. That makes so much sense. All right. So Sarah, let's switch gears into the Mindful Fire Final Four. So the first question is, in the book, you talk a lot about enjoyment as a kind of barometer of success. Can you share your thoughts on that and maybe a practice or two of how we can actually cultivate the capacity for enjoyment? It seems super obvious on its head, but at the same time, it's like we talked about with the book at the beginning. It seems so simple, so obvious, but like, will it work? How do I actually do it?
Yep. So let's think about enjoyment for a moment first. Imagine that you're enjoying your work, whatever it is, whether you have a job or a business or you're independent already, or you're enjoying the way you spend your time. You're enjoying your family, you're enjoying your money, you're enjoying your house and where you live, you're enjoying your whatever activities you do when you're not working. Does that sound like a good life? Pretty good. Yeah. Enjoyment is just a very simple barometer. It's something you can, if I talk about joy, it's like, oh, joy, that's a much bigger thing. But enjoyment, a 5-year-old can enjoy something and a 99-year-old can enjoy something. We can all get that. So I think enjoyment is just very useful. And I've talked a little bit in this conversation about being attracted towards the pleasure of things, the pleasure of life. And that's a full, rich pleasure. It's not the pleasure of getting something. It's the pleasure of living. So enjoyment comes with that. How do you do that more? Enjoyment is a lot simpler than we think. And I'll give you an example. I had a client a few years ago who was suicidally depressed. And I'd met him for the first time. And he was going off on a trip to some kind of adventure theme park or something with his kids. And I said, look, could you just make a deal with yourself that you enjoy the day with them? Because he was dreading it because he was going to be the drag on the whole family because he was so depressed. He came back to me the next day and said, I had the most amazing time, Sarah. I enjoyed every bit of it. He was just as depressed, actually. Like he hadn't really solved his depression because he didn't make the click that he just decided to enjoy the day instead of not. So often we have a habit of thinking, oh, work, oh, that's not really enjoyable. I'm working. I know people who see work as a dirty word. Whereas to me, work is something for enjoying. But if you think, oh, this is a boring email I've got to write, it's like, yeah, but I'm going to enjoy it. Because why not? Because you can. You will find that you can. If you make the decision to enjoy something, you'll enjoy it. If you make the decision that it's really hard and heavy and you don't want to do it, it's going to be really hard and heavy and you're not going to want to do it. So it's in your hands. Enjoyment is in your hands.
Sounds like, to summarize, enjoyment is a choice.
Enjoyment is a choice. I agree.
There you go. All right. So the second question is, what piece of advice would you give to someone early on their path to financial independence?
I would say really look for freedom, not just independence. Independence is a bit of a myth because we're never independent. You're not independent of nature, of people, of society, of the system, any of it. We're very interdependent. I would say look for freedom, look for true freedom, which includes financial freedom, inner freedom, whatever it is, really explore that, because we're very attracted to that as human beings. Just, so that it's not all about the money. It's about the money plus.
Yeah, very good. And I would also add, read Sarah's book, Love Money, Money Loves You. I think it will help quite a bit as well, because this conversation in your book has really made my kind of view of things around financial independence more well-rounded, I would say.
Yeah.
So the next question is, what piece of advice would you give to someone getting started with meditation and or mindfulness?
Whoa, I teach a lot. I teach relaxation, but it's as good as any of those things that you've talked about. The biggest mistake that people make is they think they've got to do it right. We're not in the territory here. We're not at school. We're not going to get marks. And the mind can throw curveballs and do all kinds of weird things inside you, and it doesn't matter. It's something to practice and get better at, and just never worry about doing it right. Also, don't worry about doing it wrong. It's just not about right or wrong. It's different. It's an experience. It's something that works as you get better at it.
Very well said. And the last question, Sarah, is how can people connect with you online and learn more about your book, your workshops, everything that you've got going on in the world?
The best place to go is my website, which is liberatehumanity.com. Also, I have a website with my name, sarahmccrumb.com, and you'll be able to find the book there. I'm very lucky that I have an unusual name, so you can look me up on Google, Sarah McCrumb. You'll find everything. Very good. I will link all of that up in the show notes so you can check it out. Thank you, Sarah. This has been absolutely wonderful. This is by far one of the best podcast conversations I've had so far, so I'm really grateful for you to take the time and to share all of your wisdom with us. Thank you. It's been really fascinating. I've never talked to this audience before around this theme of financial independence. So it's been really fascinating for me to have that experience. Thanks for joining me on today's episode of the Mindful Fire podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, I invite you to hit subscribe wherever you're listening to this. This just lets the platforms know you're getting value from the episodes and you want to be here when I release additional content. If you're ready to start your Mindful Fire journey, go to mindfulfire.org/start. and download my free envisioning guide. In just 10 minutes, this guide will help you craft a clear and inspiring vision for your life. Again, you can download it for free at mindfulfire.org/start. Thanks again, and I'll catch you next time on the Mindful Fire podcast.